Lincoln, I'm so excited to start off this conversation today. I want us to put our minds, listeners, into a mindset of thinking about what sustainability really means, what it means in our business, what it means in our homes, what it means in our university settings, and also how we think about how sustainability is actually an agent of innovation. And I'm very excited to have my guest with me today, Lincoln Bleavens, who is going to be talking to us about all the different ways of thinking about innovation when it comes to the environment, climate, and sustainability. And the reason why he is such a fantastic guest is because he not only has this academic background, but because he's been an executive in the global energy industry for nearly 30 years, focused on electric power and sustainability. Lincoln currently leads Stanford University's Mission Essential Operations and world-leading innovation in sustainability and resilience, energy and water, civil infrastructure, building automation and energy management, emergency preparedness, and employee safety, all the way down to waste management, which we're going to be spending a little bit of time on today. He's an active mentor and board member for technology startups in North America and Europe and in India, and even has a podcast called Climate Changes Everything. Lincoln, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today.
Oh, I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you.
So let's get started from where you got started. So you're an energy executive, you're humming along, doing your thing, and then sustainability. Is this something that has been with you since the beginning of your career, or is this something that has become more and more a part of your consciousness over time? What was it like when you were first getting started in the space?
Yeah, it was, I would love to say that this was front of mind from the beginning, but
Mhm.
it really wasn't. It's been something that has been growing for me. When I first started off in the power business back in the 90s, we were still building coal plants, for example, in China. We were still building fuel oil plants in Central America.
And they still
And
are, right? Those coal plants haven't gone away in China, right? In fact, they're
oh,
building.
absolutely. Even more and more. So that was the reality then. And it was a really interesting thing because back then, for example, natural gas was still seen as the environmental alternative. That was the environmentally conscious alternative.
Some good
And
marketing right there.
yeah, yeah. And things like wind and solar were very much at the fringes, very much at very small scales and incredibly expensive. So still at the fringes. And I've been really blessed to have seen the energy business and the electricity business in particular both grow and evolve from a very regulated, vertically integrated sort of the traditional legacy model to a much more competitive model, but also see it evolve from renewables at the very edge of the equation, the very edge of the conversation, to renewables firmly at the center of the conversation. And in fact, pretty much taking over the entire conversation. So that's been a really interesting thing to be on the front lines of. And so for me personally, it's also been a journey of seeing the externalities more clearly of a coal plant or a gas plant and looking at those things from the perspective of not only solving for dollars and cents, which is the traditional model, but now solving, especially here in California, solving for greenhouse gases as well, and trying to find the connection point between the right economic answer and the right environmental slash climate slash environmental justice answer. So it's been a really interesting evolution for me, and particularly being in public power in California, in Southern California, where I was for about 9 years, and now basically doing the same thing, but on a much broader canvas here at Stanford. It's really grown for me to the point where solving for dollars and solving for greenhouse gases, those are co-equal variables in the equation for me. I look at
Mm.
dollars and cents.
Wow. Wait, when did that
Yeah.
shift happen,
Yeah.
Lincoln? Like, yeah, when did that shift happen when it really started to become an imperative as opposed to an annoyance or and something that maybe was even a threat to something that had to be taken seriously to something that is now, part and parcel?
For me personally, it was Superstorm Sandy. Excuse me. I was living in the New York suburbs at the time,
Mhm.
and this is right before I moved to California. And it was extraordinary. It was, I saw Katrina from afar. I saw, Andrew from afar, the other big storms.
Yep.
But to live through Sandy, and frankly, we had it easy where I lived. We were
Where
out
were
for six.
you, Lincoln?
I was in Dutchess County, New York, in Pawling, New York, a little
I know it
revolutionary
well.
little
I'm in
town.
Rockland County, so
Yes.
I'm very familiar as a New Yorker. I was very impacted by Sandy.
Yeah, and seeing my mother-in-law in Westchester County be out for 3 weeks. We were out for 6 days. We had it about as easy as anybody had it. But then seeing what happened in the city and in New Jersey, and boats that were big boats that were propelled by waves onto train tracks and
Right.
just sitting there on train tracks, subway, the subway system full of water. That to me was the culmination of a series of what in retrospect are now were pretty big wake-up calls in and of themselves. But for me, that's when the rubber really hit the road. And I would love to say, oh no, this was front of mind much earlier, but it was a process of this foundation of understanding being built up. And then with Sandy, there was absolutely, for me, there was no turning back
Mhm.
in, 2011, 2012 timeframe. There was no turning back, both from a sustainability perspective, which I think is as mitigating climate change, but then the adaptation and resilience part, which is how do we change our world so that we can best thrive in a climate changing world. So both of those things became front of mind. And then I moved out to California to work at Burbank Water and Power, where both from a regulatory perspective, but also a cultural perspective, a policy perspective, we were already moving very firmly into a renewable driven mindset, a zero GHG driven mindset. And that has just accelerated from there. So that's where I am now, where literally my equation, uh, economics and environment and justice are co-equal variables in my personal equation.
And that next shift now, so for you, that was Hurricane Sandy. But what do you think about industry when it said, okay, yeah, no mas? Is that was that major accords that were taking place? Or what do you think? When did we really become? Because I remember being in a play about Mother Nature and garbage management, back in the Carter administration, when, we were thinking about greenhouse gases, acid rain, right? These were some of the things that we were talking about back then, not to mention things that impacted energy, even like overpopulation and, smog and air pollution. Like these
Yeah.
were the qualities while we were waiting online for gas, right? For more fossil fuels. That's when I wrote my first letter to the president of the United States saying, what are you going to do about the energy crisis, Mr. Carter? Because my mom and dad are really upset about being on long lines at the gas station. I got a very nice picture of the Carters and Amy back, but I don't know how much. I assume a lot has changed since then.
Absolutely. I actually remember, speaking of the Carter administration, maybe this is the fourth, second grade, Kingsley Elementary School in Evanston, Illinois, in science class, learning about the environment. And I'll never forget it. The solution to pollution is dilution. The solution to pollution is dilution. And
Wow.
that was the idea. The idea that the air and the oceans and the soil can I mean, the underlying assumption there was that we can basically absorb whatever human beings do from a pollution perspective, and pollution being the catch-all phrase at that time. But the idea was that we basically have an infinite sink for all of the consequences of what we do. And to see that change over time, to see this idea of a finite planet emerge over time. And in some places that I think that's kind of standard thinking, that's become a no-brainer. In other places, I think there's still a sense that maybe climate change is not, and pollution are not. Where I think there's still that infinite planet thinking, but frankly, it's been really interesting to see how that's moved and how different parts of the world have experienced that differently and reacted to it differently. I remember being in India in the 90s, and it was in New Delhi in August. It was beastly hot, but you could breathe. And whereas August in Beijing, I would get a sore throat between the airport and the hotel.
Wow.
But now you go to Delhi in August and it's got some of the worst air quality in the world. And so that to me is unfortunately, human beings, I think most of us have to feel things in order to react to them. And you see China in the lead up. I'll never forget this. When Hong Kong transferred, I happened to be back to China in 1997. I happened to be in Beijing at the time, and they had shut down all the coal-fired power plants and all the factories. So there was blue sky, and a lot of Beijingers, frankly, had not seen a lot of blue sky in their lives. And then the Olympics happened, and I think there was over there, and so you need blue sky again. And I think there was a reaction to local circumstances. You're seeing that in India now too, I think, with the reaction. They're all in on renewable energy now. And I think in part, it's we react to what we experience. I think the question is then, how do we think about this not as a localized thing that people have to feel to react to, but to realize that greenhouse gases are a planetary phenomenon. They're geography agnostic. Sea level rise, it's all one big ocean. Sea level rise is geography agnostic. These storm patterns are geography agnostic. So how do we create this mentality in the world where we actually realize, and maybe for the first time in human history, that what I do in one part of the planet has a direct impact on another part of the planet, and I need to care about that.
Right.
That's a big jump for humans.
Something you said really stuck out for me, which is we don't really understand the impact until we feel it. And I think that's part of what, how we create the narratives around climate change, because so much of it has been so unsuccessful, or we feel so bombarded by these climate messages and a lot of disinformation, right? Or a lot of, we don't need to do anything about this, kind of stay in the status quo space. That's been incredibly powerful. I mean, industries loved it, but what you said was, we don't really get it till we feel it sometimes. And even then, when we feel it, we're being told that what we feel isn't real. So tell us a little bit about, the work that you're doing at Stanford and how we actually get people to raise their awareness, to feel it. And then, the stories that we tell to actually get them to take action.
Yeah, it's a absolutely fascinating and front of mind question here at Stanford. We are it is fundamental to our mission that we are optimizing for Stanford, obviously, but also trying to provide an exemplar for the rest of the world in everything we do.
That's a big mandate.
It's a huge mandate. And and when we do that, we're trying to move the needle forward We're trying to de-risk things that would otherwise still be too risky. Our district energy system is a perfect example of that, where we basically went out and did a first of its kind renewable electricity powered heat recovering hot and chilled water district energy plant that, when it came online in 2015, was really the first of its kind at scale, dropped our campus-wide greenhouse gas footprint down by 78% from our peak in 2011.
How?
Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
How?
Yeah, no,
How
incredible,
did that happen?
incredible. And, going from renewable electricity, or from a natural gas fired cogeneration plant producing electricity and steam, to renewable electricity running conventional chillers and heat recovery chillers, recovering a ton of heat on campus in the campus loop, as opposed to, and using that as fuel, as opposed to sending that up to the cooling towers. And then going from a steam-based system, which has been the default for hundreds of years, that is the default form of thermal energy, is steam, but saying, hey, we can do this without steam. We can do this with a lower temperature, lower energy product like hot water and chilled water. We have to redo a bunch of our system, retrofit a bunch of buildings. But for example, with going from steam to hot and chilled water, our distribution losses went from the 30% range to the 3% range. So instead of losing a third of the product in distribution, we're now losing a tiny fraction of the product. Water consumption associated with thermal energy went down by 74%.
Wow.
Just extraordinary outcomes, and frankly, better economics and better reliability too. So it was a win all around, but it was a situation where not only did we need to create this innovation, and my brilliant predecessor, he's retired now, a guy named Joe Stagner, this was his thing, this was his idea. But we had to convince our internal stakeholders that this would work, that this was a good idea, this was possible. It's first of its kind at this scale, but it'll work. And so there was a really intensive process, that I wasn't here for, but there was a really intensive process of meeting our stakeholders internally where they were.
Mm.
And these are world famous scientists and engineers in the faculty, for example, meeting them where they were, helping them get comfortable, bringing them on as allies in this effort, which was really hard. But we all understood that with an end of life cogen plant, we could either lean back on the comfortable old solutions, but still be greenhouse gas intensive, particulate emission intensive, all of the things that come with that. Or we could lean in and say, you know what, what's the Stanford thing to do? The Stanford thing to do is to find the next solution, the solution that solves for the next 30 years and not the last 30 years. And how do we bring the extraordinary resources that we have here, speaking of storytelling, motivate them to participate in that process, and then create this outcome that we've had thousands of groups come through our central energy facility. And I'm putting out an open invitation to anybody, just drop me an email. We'll get you through. We have great tours on Thursday mornings. But how do we then provide an exemplar? And we've got Princeton University is doing a very similar thing. There are projects all over the world that have taken our example and taken our effort in de-risking this technology, this combination of technologies, so that we've actually moved the needle with that project. And what we're trying to do now, speaking of waste that you mentioned earlier, we're in the midst of once a century overhaul in, I think it's 92 years or something, that we've had the exact same waste management system and the exact same program, a very old school program. And now we've got a zero waste by 2030 target. And so we have gone through an incredible RFP process with our haulers, but more than that, created a brand new system so that we can, again, lean into the future and make sure that we reach zero waste by 2030. Fundamentally, that's even more than energy. That's so much more behavior change than it is technology, but it's always that duality. The technology doesn't work without the behavior change, and often the behavior change isn't effective without the technology. You got to bring both of those two things together. Yeah, so that's our next exciting thing as we move forward.
Wow. So is the goal of the center to, number one, reduce the carbon footprint of what's happening on campus? Or is it, and maybe it's and not an or, is to create really innovative solutions that also other campuses and industry can follow, since you're kind of making yourselves the guinea pigs for these programs?
Yeah, it's really, in my mind, it's really both. I mean, our mandate first and foremost is to optimize for Stanford. And that means, for example, in my world where I run utilities and infrastructure as well as sustainability and resilience, operations always comes first. The operational outcomes always come first. But what we're finding is that in order to create operational outcomes that also meet our policy goals, we have an opportunity to innovate in the way we solve that equation. And so when we think about whether it's energy or water or waste or the way we run the controls in our buildings for electricity and thermal energy, all of it, the way we electrify our transportation fleet, for example, as we look at these systems that need renewal, we have an opportunity to lean in, and not only an opportunity to lean in, but really an obligation, both economically and environmentally, to lean in. And so it's an incredibly exciting time because we have this, what's really kind of basically a small vertically integrated city. That's what Stanford is. I mean, it looks like a research university, but I mean, from my perspective, it's really a small vertically integrated city.
So it's a smart city is what you're hoping, right?
And we need to make it a smart city. Absolutely. So we have, with each one of these things, we're optimizing for the university. And what we're finding is that by optimizing for the university, we are also finding solutions that we hope we can tell the rest of the world about, and that the rest of the world will adapt and implement and join us in leaning forward into these new solutions. So it's an incredible, Stanford is an incredible, this is a little bit of a recruitment pitch, but Stanford is an incredibly exciting place to be from that applied innovation, that applied sustainability perspective. And that's what drew me here about 3 years ago.
Wow. Because it's trying to be a beacon on a hill for something that is really controversial, right? Do we start the storytelling with the results, or do we need to get people on board to start changing their behavior as we're implementing new projects? How does the storytelling part come into play for you, Lincoln?
To me, it's absolutely essential. My experience is that human beings are ultimately, we live on narratives are our fuel, and that is first and foremost. Everything flows from what you're trying to achieve from an outcome perspective. Basically, the way I describe it, working from the right side of the whiteboard back to the left side. Here are the outcomes that we want to achieve. Here's why we want to achieve them. That you got to get that narrative right at the very beginning, and you have to understand who's hearing that narrative and who you want to be influenced by that narrative. Here at Stanford, we have a whole lot of different stakeholders. We have our administration, we have our faculty, we have our students who are of a generation that won't take no or even slow for an answer on a lot of this innovation and a lot of these outcomes. We have an incredible Stanford community, both locally in terms of local governments and organizations, but also the innovation ecosystem in Silicon Valley, of which Stanford is basically the beating heart of that ecosystem. And then an alumni and donor community that is absolutely mind-bogglingly brilliant and engaged. And so it's finding that narrative and then making sure that you're meeting your audience, whatever that audience is, you're meeting them where they are with that narrative. And ultimately that narrative is, we're going to do the right thing for Stanford. We're going to make operations better. We're going to support the mission of teaching and research in healthcare better. But at the same time, we're going to make things better in the other ways that are equally important, which is the policy outcomes, both the climate and, frankly, being a good citizen. When we shut off that cogen plant, we not only reduced greenhouse gas emissions almost to zero, but we also reduced particulate emissions and NOx and SOx and the other things that we were putting into the air locally. So, and that's a story I want to tell a little bit more strongly, is that there are environmental justice components to these things too. Locally, you've got to tell the global story, but you've also got to tell the local story. How are you making the world better in your own backyard?
Yeah. I still recall I lived in Newark, New Jersey for a brief time. Tough neighborhood, right? Very high, very high minority population, very high poverty rate, high unemployment rate. And I still remember the city was struggling whether or not to invite a fourth trash incinerator into the city, which would generate 100 jobs. And the conversation around and high asthma rates, as you typically get in low-income neighborhoods, and how city, elders were making the decision around, do I need jobs more? Do I need clean air more? Do I need an economic engine that could draw even more commerce to the city if possible? And figuring out how to make that work. I mean, these equity conversations are really important and they're happening all the time, right? With this balance of trying to figure out how it works.
Yeah, well, we're addressing that, or trying to address that exact problem in our new waste management program. We mapped where our waste goes, and we've got tens of thousands of people here, and so we make a lot of waste, and including the hospitals and everything else. And we map that on the peninsula here where we live. And where's it going? It's going to places that are communities of color, lower income communities. It's not going to the places where the rich people are.
Nope.
And how do we address that? How do we make that better? If you look at the history of waste, and this is how big of a geek I am, the history of waste management is actually fascinating. I can recommend a couple of good books, but people 100 years ago, say before the First World War, people saw the circularity in their waste.
Mm-hmm.
There were rag pickers, and the rag pickers were gathering up discarded fabric, clothing or bedding or what have you, because that was a primary input into the paper making industry. And so you separated out your rags, and the rag picker came around and you sold or gave the rags to the rag picker. And that fiber made its way back, that waste made it back, became an input for paper making. And there was a visible circularity there. And with World War I in particular, there was kind of a step change in the generation of waste in terms of consumer goods, consumer packaging, but also the invisibility of waste. And to the point now where it is literally out of sight, out of mind.
And it's dumped on other developing countries, right? I mean, it's not even stored in our national borders anymore.
Yep.
Yeah.
And so it just goes away. For a
Yep.
lot of us, as to your point, especially in the rich world, especially in the rich parts of the rich world, that waste stream, you put it in the bin and it's, every Thursday morning in my neighborhood, it disappears.
Right.
And so how do you really think about circularity? How do you really impress upon your fellow human beings the importance of circularity if it is not only invisible to them price wise, we're not paying for it in a way that we can see and manipulate and manage, but it's also just disappearing in reality. It just goes somewhere, and that somewhere is not here, and we go on with our lives. Those to me are the stories that we need to tell. To me, it's all one of the big themes for me is internalizing externalities. The way I think of them, they're not internet externalities or internalities, they're just ternalities. So you heard it here first. I just made up a new word, but how do we
That's what innovation storytelling is all about. We just invent new words when we're trying to create a better story. Why not? Sure.
That's exactly it. So how do we take, we have, as in our modern society, we have created an extraordinary universe of externalities that most of us never see, let alone manage or worry about. And to me, a big part of this storytelling is bringing those externalities back into the picture. And that means seeing them and recognizing them and acknowledging them, acknowledging their impact, but then finding ways, meaningful ways to manage that as individuals, as institutions, as companies, as governments. So that to me is a big mind that needs to happen. And going back to the narrative, you've got to find a way to tell that story in a way that resonates and is empathy, reaches your audience where it is. Because without those narratives, there's no impact emotionally or otherwise. And without that impact on your audience, they're not going to change anything. They're not going to do anything different.
So, if I could direct you as well, so I know you're going to offer us some resources as listeners, but I had a fantastic guest on episode 93 with Dr. Judith Tumusime, who is from Uganda. I went from Uganda to Harvard, and she is affectionately known by people in the waste management industry as the Queen of Trash, and completely revitalized different cities within Uganda based on waste management, like revitalizing city centers, thinking about smart cities. But the starting point was waste management, and really shifting how not only city fathers and mothers got involved with that shift, but also the likes of Coca-Cola and Pepsi of creating new solutions along the way, even in developing countries. And she is now the federal grants manager for the city of Cambridge. So she has taken what was developing world knowledge about waste management and moving it into spaces like Harvard and Cambridge. And I would love to connect you, actually. I think you'd be, but certainly I'll post it in the show notes too, episode 93. We had a great conversation about what we can all do to make this better. It's starting with our institutions. So, Lincoln, I also want to ask you, typically I ask all of my guests some very specific questions when they come on the show. So first off, 3 decades working in energy and sustainability, what is some advice that you can give our audience members who are all innovators by job function and I would say by inclination? So what kind of advice can you give to us? If you had to give us 3 big points to take away, what would you want us to know and what we could start applying in our own environments right now around sustainability?
I think the 3 big ones for me would be, first and foremost, I believe that our world has fundamentally changed in the last couple of years. It's been growing for a while, but just in the last couple of years, climate change, endemic, long overdue, obviously, but
long overdue the corrections to those things.
Yeah, renewed focus on diversity, equity, inclusion, justice. Technologies like artificial intelligence in particular, this hybrid life that we're now leading, and these rising population generations that, like I said, aren't taking no or even slow for an answer. I actually see that as a change in the human condition akin to the Neolithic revolution,
Mm.
the development of agriculture and how that fundamentally changed human lives. I look at climate change in particular as a one-way step function in a world and in a human mindset that is used to cycles, economic cycles, political cycles, what have you. I think our world has fundamentally changed. And thus the equation, the human equation for success has fundamentally changed. It's still monetary gain, it's still material gain, but it's also diversity, equity, inclusion, justice, sustainability, resilience as co-equal variables in that equation. That to me is the new reality.
Mm.
And thus, so many of the assumptions that we've made, big and small, maybe they don't need to change, but they certainly need to get re-examined. I think about, just to use a very simple example of our energy system, steam versus hot and chilled water. Are we going to lean back on steam just because it's been the no-brainer for hundreds of years? Or are we going to lean forward? Maybe we would have come up with a different answer to that. But we need to examine those assumptions. We need to examine assumptions about circularity. And it's not just on the energy side, it's not just coal and natural gas. We need to look at the life cycles of solar panels, the full life cycles of wind turbines and lithium ion batteries. It's terrifying on the front end and the back end. It's wonderful in the middle, but it's terrifying on the front end of the back end, the rare earth extraction, the processing, the recycling, the disposal. We need to broaden our gaze. And I think that would really be number two, is we really need to challenge our assumptions, but in a way that looks at those externalities again. Externalities are no longer, the age of externalities is over. We've got to look at the whole picture. And then you think about the people who are going to be really effective in that environment.
Mm.
It's not the round pegs. So many of us go through our lives machining and sanding and doing and camouflaging our square pegness. We're all square pegs, but the round pegs are not going to be able to make that adjustment. We've got to embrace our square pegness. We have to embrace the unique view that we bring to the world, the unique skills and background that we bring to problem solving, because you can't change a square peg problem, frankly, an unprecedented challenge, whether it's technology innovation or behavior change or both, by being a round peg. The round pegs aren't going to make history. It's the square pegs. Mm-hmm. And so as much as we all need to learn, in my opinion, as much as you can about history and finance and engineering and sociology and psychology and all these things that we've been learning for generations, the way we apply those is through our square pegness and not through our round pegness, if that makes sense. Again, I've made up like 4 words in this whole podcast, but that to me, those are the people who are going to be successful in changing the world.
Yeah. Wonderful. Okay. So now I'm going to ask you the 3 big questions I ask all my guests. Number 1, what is the greatest invention of all time?
I'm going to say the Klondike bar.
Wait, are you straight vanilla with chocolate, or are you looking now at the mint chocolate chip, the crunch covered ones? What say you?
I don't care.
Yeah.
I should probably say the York peppermint patty. That may be humankind's greatest achievement. Yes. But I actually think,
and the sound it makes.
Yes. I actually think the greatest invention of all time.
I mean, you could have left it right there, Lincoln. It would have been fine.
That's true. That's true. I will say, I'll just leave it at water technology. The ability to provide clean water to human beings, to me, is everything changes without that.
Yeah. It's amazing because we all started with that. Every time I have a
Yeah,
friend visiting from Finland or Iceland, it takes them a good month just to get acclimated to the chlorine scent coming off the water
yeah,
and the fluoride aftertaste, which they are absolutely convinced they can taste. So, because they're just drinking out of a glacier,
yeah.
ordinarily. Okay, so question number 2 is, if you had the ability to join any innovation team in the history of innovation, what team would you have wanted to be on?
Wow, what a question. You can tell you didn't tee me up for these
Nope,
before the
we don't tee
podcast.
anybody up for this.
I
It's a lot of
That
good.
question is going to haunt me. And I wish I had a really snappy answer right off the top of my head. I look back to, I'm a car nut. So I'm going to say all the crazy, crazy experimentation that was going on 130, 140 years ago around automobiles. And that's not the environmental answer. That's the Lincoln, the car nut answer.
Mm.
But I think that, separating mobility has been such a profound change, and I think such a profound improvement for human lives and our ability to see different parts of the world, our ability to interact and trade with other parts of the world. That so there's a little bit of a little bit of big picture there, but mostly I'm a car nut, so I would want to go back and be one of those tinkerers back.
Like you're hanging out with Henry Ford, kind of like tinkering, or a little bit further.
Maybe a little bit further,
Yeah.
but to me that would have been a lot of fun. But your question is going to haunt me because I know I've got a better answer for it.
Well,
I
you're
just
welcome to come back and share it with us for sure.
There you go.
And then if there's something that really pisses you off or something you simply wish existed in the world today, what innovation do we need that we don't currently have?
The first thing that came to mind was a BS detector, and I wasn't going to say the whole word. I think that would be incredibly powerful. But on I to me, I think I'm going to stick with the theme of transportation here because I really struggle with the the carbon impact of transportation, especially air travel. But at the same time, I'm profoundly aware that humans are a face-to-face, in-person species. And I so I can't imagine that we're going to solve this global problem without intense global mobility. So if I could, so that leads to, if we could create a GHG free way to travel on an intercontinental basis, that to me would be would be a turbocharger on global innovation. Having more people, molecules, atoms bouncing off of each other in person in real time. Going back to your Uganda example, there is absolutely no reason why the first world, the developed world, so to speak, should think that they have a monopoly on problem solving. The great innovations are just as
We might
likely.
have a monopoly on problem creation,
We
actually.
may,
Might just have cornered the market on that.
we're really good at that. We're really good at that. But finding, her story is a story of mobility. It's problem solving, but then it's the mobility of that solution that we can now apply on a global basis. And so if we can create an intercontinental mobility solution for human beings, not Zooms, not emails, but literally human beings in person together around a whiteboard with a lot of coffee. That's how we best solve this problem
Mhm.
together. And all
Yeah.
those square pegs and all those backgrounds and all those, different views on the world, all those different identities, all those different perspectives. together working on the problems. That's how. So I guess the GHG A320 Airbus that would be my dream.
Fantastic. Lincoln, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today. How can people get in touch with you if they want to learn more about Stanford and the center and the work that you're doing?
The best thing is probably LinkedIn, because I am the only Lincoln Bleavens on LinkedIn, as far as I can tell. So it's a great advantage of having an unusual first name and a last name that is horribly misspelled, mispronounced Welsh that almost nobody else has.
Yes, but it rhymes with heavens. So who's to say?
There we go. There we go. So yes, LinkedIn is the best bet, and just look me up. And I love to engage. That is one of my greatest joys. So would love to hear from
Fantastic.
everybody.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining me today on the Innovation Storyteller Show. I really appreciate it.
Great. Thank you so much.